Fashion designer extraordinaire Aleona Isakova held a Beauty by God competition in 2018. One of the winners was Shannon Melick. Listen to her amazing story of how she won to achieve her dream of becoming a haute couture fashion designer.
My name's Shannon. I'm one of the designers for the Beauty by God contest. I went to Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. I've always just loved design and drawing and being in touch with creating things, always moving my hands, and couldn't keep focused on a class without sketching something, always doing math class while drawing dresses and buildings and things like that. So I got into design from there. There was a trend. I started just drawing all the time, and slowly it started to gravitate into people. And then people went from being focused on the person and their body to the clothing and the details on the clothing. And one day, one of my friends walked by and she looks down and she goes, "You draw an awful lot of clothing." She's like, "You should study fashion." I'm like, "Oh, that's a good idea." My dad did something he hated for 30 some odd years, absolutely hated it. He went into it for money. So when he heard I wanted to do design, he was like, "Just go, do it, pursue it, whatever." And we were originally gonna do community college, like Nova, really cheap. And when he heard fashion, he's like, "No, New York or bust. We're gonna go for it." I ended up inheriting some money from a great aunt who passed away, who was wicked good at stock market investment. And so I got this slice of money and then scholarship from the school, and it was like, I can afford this now. Suddenly I had the money to go, and I just went for it and moved away. So that was the start of the whole fashion journey. And it was a rough road through college, because the whole design college environment is a very harsh thing. They use critique panels, and the professors aren't very nurturing. They just point out everything they don't like and don't really bother to tell you how to improve it. And it's just sort of this drumbeat of, you have to be up all night, all the time to be considered doing a good job, and this hard, just constant production and exhaustion. And then you go in and you get torn up by a whole panel of professors, and you go home and you rinse and repeat all through it. And by near senior year, my dad was, I was doing my last internship in DC at the National Opera, and he knew I was going to be commuting by the metro, and I hadn't been studying at all, really, the Bible through college. Like, I'd picked it up every so often, like for a summer. I would be like, I'm going to read this book of the Bible and go through it. But I was very inconsistent in college, and just not a lot of time, it felt like, to do it. And he's like, "How could you integrate your faith into your work at school?" And he's like, "Why don't you try doing something Bible-based or figure something out?" And I was like, I had no idea what I wanted to do for my senior collection at that point. And I thought, how could that go wrong? Every day on the way to the internship, I was during track repairs, so it took 2 hours. I took my little notebooks with me, and I would I went through the Bible, and at first I was looking for examples of light, because I was like, what would be something pretty descriptive for like images in the Bible? And I started doing research and grabbing a verse that had a really cool description in it, and then I would go and research the images related to it and create these little mood boards and notes with scriptures and images. And I just did this all through my commute through that internship, all summer long, every day on the metro. And eventually I had this really dense book of just all sorts of inspiration and images, but it wasn't there yet. It didn't really feel it. It was cool. It could have great visual to it, but after having so much trouble at school, I was sort of not in a good place mentally, still going into that next semester, and the sketching didn't go very well when I got back. It felt lost. The ideas were just very historically accurate to regions and too costume almost, and I went through all this effort with the second notebook, and it was one notebook after another, and just the The garments weren't flowing and I wasn't making anything that looked that great at all or really grabbed me, and the professors weren't into it, and it was a very vague concept. It was too broad. I was pulling from all over the Bible and it wasn't very focused, and it was just light and imagery, and it was too too hard to create a solid concept of cohesive visual for the whole collection. They kept on getting on my case about it, and meanwhile, right before going back to school for that semester, I had found out that my mom got pancreatic cancer. We took her to the hospital, and we didn't quite, they did a procedure and they found out she was blocked somewhere, and it was caught turning her color, and there was all sorts of silliness in the room. She's always had a great attitude. We were laughing in the room after a procedure about her color, that she'd turned yellow. So my mom was like, at first I was like, oh, I'm gonna stay home. And she was like, no, you're going back and you're finishing college. Because she wouldn't let me take a gap year between high school and college. She's like, you have to finish your education now. And so I went back, and this whole thing starts with the just not feeling the flow. It's sort of in the back of your mind, niggling there, like, oh, something's not right at home. I should be home with her. And nothing was going well. I was failing most of the classes that semester, wasn't sleeping much at all. And so at some point, I had just decided that I wasn't gonna be able to pass. The professors had pulled me aside and they were like, you're not gonna be able to pass this year. You're gonna have to redo the whole year. And I'm sitting there like, I don't have the money for it. We had just run out of all the scholarship and all the inheritance. And I'm sitting there like, I can't pay to redo that whole semester. As long as I can pass all of those other classes, I should be able to hold those credits. And we sort of struck a deal with them, and they were like, you can go home and redo your whole collection to get to that halfway point at the end of the first semester where you're cutting off here and going home, and represent that at the end of spring for a chance to just come back and redo spring instead of the whole year. In school, we were always talking about social issues and social justice and women's rights and all of these things, and I started to pick up on that whole, like, people thinking of the Bible as misogynistic, and I was like, I know there are old cultural things that old cultures did that weren't too nice towards women, but the Bible itself is not misogynistic. And I was like, I identify myself as a feminist of sorts, and I thought, how can I, right as everything's crashing down and I'm making this deal with the professors, suddenly it hit me, I could focus on women in the Bible. And instead of fighting to do this historical costume perspective, I could work with things I loved, like women and flowers and imagery that I loved. And I went and I still used like an old pattern base to make this. Esther was the first look that I designed, and I sat down and made this huge cloak pattern, this huge robe, and put it together in that last week of negotiations and presented it to the professors, and they loved it. Esther was really inspiring to me because her story was it's such a odd, non-traditional story. There are things about her situation that are very, I would find unsettling to be picked up by one of the king's servants and be like, yeah, you're gonna join his harem and compete for top spot. But all the beauty treatments and that competition and the concept of going into that sounds terrifying to me. Like, I wouldn't want to just be thrown at some random dude and said, this is your husband now because you're hotter than the rest of the women in this harem. But she was so mature about it and took it so well. And then she was a Jewish girl too, and she goes into this situation, becomes respected and loved by the king. They seem to have a good relationship going on, and then she has this opportunity to save her people from the Haman's plot to kill them. And I'm like, this is a really cool thing. She goes into his chambers with, you were supposed to get an appointment. You could get killed for just marching in to Xerxes' chambers at the throne room. and just marches in and makes her plight of her people and this plot known against the king and against her people. Well, I went home after that, actually. There was a period of just relaxing with the family. We went on a once-in-a-lifetime kind of trip and relaxed, and I came back feeling refreshed from that. And then I started to look into the rest of the collection. So it was sort of the January on, I had about 4 months to make 8 looks, which could imply 1 dress to 3 garments per look, depending on the what's involved. And I took a trip to, I've created the list of women first. This is the wrong notebook. But I created a list of the women, and I chose Esther, Ruth, Deborah, Huldah, Mary of Bethany, not Jesus' mom, Martha, Priscilla, and Aquila. I'll go into that later. And who am I forgetting? Ruth, that's it. And I selected them, I read their stories, and sort of chose people that I felt like got a broad cross-section of women in the Bible and different roles and things that they did better, because Martha was more of the servant side, but Deborah and Huldah were in charge of things and God, making decisions and going into battles and being sought after for counsel and things like that, and just trying to get this full snapshot of all different types of women in the Bible and walks of life and how they were respected in their stories. They weren't trampled upon. There wasn't anything misogynistic about their lives, although, I mean, the harem thing, but we decided to overlook that. We decided to, so I started going through, and I took a big trip to New York and went swatching. I had no design sketched at all, and just went to New York and started buying fabric that I was just drawn to. I just went, which is a reckless approach to design, but I just bought as much yardage as I thought I could need of a big cross-section of fabrics that fit color stories for their flowers. Because I had gone in and researched flower language for the collection. So each woman's traits I went through, and I would choose their strong traits, what they were known for, and then go and look up flower language and what herbs or flowers were the language equivalent of their traits. And so those colors were how I started pulling colors and textures of fabric from that, and going around and finding things that I thought could be useful, and just probably spending more money. There's leftover fabric because my approach was kind of backwards. But I came home with just these 2 big suitcases of fabric, a list of women, their traits, flowers, and just was like, I gotta make things now. So that's how everything started with the collections. Jesus, to me, is just unconditional love and grace. And I think I've had an interesting front row seat to seeing it in my house, that coming through, because my parents were divorced. And even though they were divorced, they acted like a married couple and unit still. And they had such I watched as we're normally, that announcement is made. My mom left him, and she came and she announces this. Normally this is the point where all communication shut down between the 2 parties. And it looked like it could be rough for a while, but one day Dad just started serving her. He didn't fight back when she would make snide comments and clobber him in court, and he just kept on coming back and helping her, no matter how bad that fight that night at the apartment had been when I got dropped off. If she called him and asked him to help her with her taxes, he was there, no matter what. Despite going through a divorce, after the divorce, years into the divorce, he was just always there for her. And that's how I think Jesus is for people. He's always there, no matter what. No matter if you turn around one day and you're just feeling really mad at God for something, He still loves you and He's still there for you to support you. And I think that really shaped my view of Jesus, is seeing an example of that unconditional love. It changed the whole tone of things, and just seeing and having encouragement from home to do that too, to pursue Jesus and pursue that grace that He exhibited by dying on the cross for us to pay for our sins. And it was just I think that really got me through college.